Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this third online seminar of the CPR Standing Group on the EU. It's a pleasure to have today our three speakers. So Jonathan Zeitlin, who is Distinguished Professor of Public Policy and Governance at the University of Amsterdam and Academic Director of the Amsterdam Study for European Studies, and is of course also the co-convener of this online seminar series of the Standing Group, and he works on new forms of experimentalist governance. As his co-author, we have Bernardo Rangoni, who is lecturer in politics at the University of York and works in the fields of regulatory governance, public policy, and political economy. And they will present a paper on EU regulation comparing two fields, electricity and banking. And their paper addresses a very intriguing question, namely how far and under what conditions experimentalist governance may be an effective and legitimate means of responding to the diversity among member states in the EU compared to uniform regulation and differentiated integration. And finally, we have Sandra Eckert, who will discuss their paper. She's currently a Marie Curie Co-Fund Fellow and Associate Professor at the Aarhus Institute of Advanced Studies and at the Goethe University. And she works on comparative public policy, European integration, and international political economy. So after this brief presentation, I'm very happy to give the floor to Jonathan and Bernardo for their presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes.
Thanks very much, Nathalie. It's a pleasure to be here. It's really nice to see. I mean, each of these seminars we do, we have a different cast of characters, and it's nice to see friends and colleagues, not only from all over Europe, but also from North America, who were able to join us. Basically, my presentation or our presentation, excuse me, will be in four parts. First, I'm going to discuss alternative approaches to integrating diversity within the EU. Then I'll introduce you briefly to the comparative setup of our research that's reported in the paper. Then Bernardo will present the key findings of his research on electricity regulation, and I'll do the same for mine on banking, and then I will offer some brief conclusions about the relationship between uniform regulation, differentiated integration, and experimentalist governance within the EU. So it's no secret that European regulation has acquired, one might say, an increasingly negative reputation, at least within the EU itself. To some extent, that's due to the perceived technocratic character of EU rulemaking, its remoteness from ordinary citizens and national parliaments. It's partly due to the politically contested character of EU rules themselves, which can and often do involve value conflicts and distributive consequences, but it's also due in large measure to critiques of the misfit between the uniform one-size-fits-all character of regulation and the heterogeneity of preferences and conditions in an increasingly diverse union. Now, one of the main alternatives, perhaps the main alternative to uniform regulation within the EU is differentiated integration, or DI. This is seen as a means of accommodating diversity among member states in terms of their policy preferences, institutional structures, socioeconomic conditions, and so on. And the underlying assumption here is that deeper integration of markets and societies requires uniform centrally determined rules, which some member states may be unable or unwilling to accept, at least initially. And so where other member states wish nonetheless to push ahead, the result is differentiated integration. Policies and rules that apply only to some member states, known in the jargon as internal DI, and also to some non-member states, external DI. Now, as research has shown, most forms of internal DI are temporary. We speak of multi-speed DI in that case, but others are more durable. We can call them multi-tier, and obviously the Euro area and Schengen are two prime examples. Now, I think it's worth reflecting on the scope conditions for this kind of enduring multi-tier DI. And broadly speaking, there are a number of these. First, of course, is heterogeneity of preferences among member states. And again, recent research has highlighted that this is especially important on constitutional or sovereignty issues that touch on core state powers. Also important is how salient and politicized the issue is, and that it should be asymmetrically so across member states. A second scope condition is interdependence. So obviously this needs to be sufficient to motivate further integration, but it also needs not to have externalities, external effects that are not so high as to preclude DI. And finally, I think it's important to emphasize modularity. So for DI to work on an enduring basis, the key policy choice has to be reducible to a binary in-out option. So we can say from this that enduring DI is most likely under conditions of heterogeneous preferences, high but asymmetrical politicization, moderate interdependence, and high modularity. Now, DI is not the only available approach to accommodating diversity within the EU, and recent research, including my own, has shown that in many core policy domains, EU governance isn't characterized by top-down imposition of rigid uniform regulations. Instead, we see experimentalist governance, I'll sometimes call that XG, defined as a recursive process of framework rulemaking and revision based on learning from comparative review of implementation experience in different local contexts. Now, this kind of governance typically involves a cycle of 4 functional steps organized as an iterative and scalable multi-level architecture. It's often further underpinned by what can be called penalty defaults, that is, mechanisms that induce reluctant parties to cooperate by threatening to impose sufficiently unattractive alternatives. In some cases, under conditions of high interdependence, concern for the integrity of integrated markets has led to the creation of a single set of harmonized but provisional rules, revisable through ongoing review of implementation experience. And just to, I will come back to this because this is very much what we find both in the cases of electricity and banking. So here is a diagram of the XG architecture. So it starts with EU institutions and member states jointly establishing framework goals, rules, and metrics, typically in consultation with civil society and business stakeholders. Then we have a measure of discretionary implementation by lower level units, let's say national ministries and regulators, in ways that are adapted to their local context. And then in return for this kind of discretion, we see obligations for regular reporting by the lower level units, participation in some kind of peer review, coming up with plausible plans for improvement where they're falling short of the objectives, informed by what peers are doing. And that then leads into periodic revision of the overarching goals, metrics, and procedures. And so we have a cycle, or ideally a spiral, of a regular and continuous improvement. Now, this kind of governance also has some scope conditions, and I want to emphasize 4 of these. The first and most important is strategic uncertainty, that policy makers or policy actors don't know their precise goals or how best to achieve them in advance. Simplifying, we can associate this with rising volatility of the policy environment. Secondly, second condition is a multipolar or polyarchic distribution of power in which no single actor is able to impose their preferred solution without taking account of the views of others. Now, I think for these purposes, for the purposes of this analysis, we can also emphasize two additional scope conditions, which are sometimes discussed in the literature. One is diversity, so the difficulty of identifying universal solutions and imposing and enforcing uniform rules under such conditions. And secondly, interdependence. So this must be sufficient to motivate a search for joint solution to common problems among the participating actors, but not so high as to preclude decentralized experimentation by local units. Now, where those scope conditions are fulfilled, arguably experimentalist governance has some important advantages over both differentiated integration and uniform regulation. First of all, it accommodates diversity by adapting common goals and rules to vary local contexts rather than imposing one-size-fits-all solutions or dividing member states into groups of ins and outs. Secondly, it's a dynamic mechanism for coordinated learning through discipline, comparison of different approaches to advancing the same general ends. And this in turn can be used to generate new policy solutions and regulatory frameworks, which can then be applied in contextually specific ways across the EU as a whole. Finally, it's corrigible by design, so that problems identified in one phase of implementation can be corrected in the next iteration. Let me say something briefly about the research that we're going to present. This comes from a Horizon 2020 project called IndiVU, Integrating Diversity in the European Union, that's just coming to an end. Our core research question, as Nathalie mentioned at the outset, is how far and under what conditions may experimentalist governance be an effective and legitimate means of responding to diversity of preferences and conditions among EU member states in comparison both to conventional uniform regulation and to differentiated integration. I should say that that's the research question for this paper and for the work package that Bernardo and I and colleagues have been working in, which is only one of the work packages of the IndiVU project, much of which deals with mainstream differentiated integration. Now, we're going to present a comparative analysis of EU regulatory governance in two policy domains, that is electricity and banking. Now, in each of these domains, the dilemma of accommodating national diversity has arisen with particular salience. Each domain is characterized by high levels of strategic uncertainty associated with rapidly changing markets and technologies. As I've said, that's a positive scope condition for XG. Each belongs, however, to the internal market, where interdependence and the resulting demand for uniform rules is strong. So that is a negative scope condition, arguably, for both DI and experimentalist governance in its classic form of the architecture I showed you as a diagram. Each of these domains is also politically salient and controversial, but to varying degrees across member states, and we can see that as a positive scope condition for DI. So the research that we did followed a process tracing approach. I combined extensive expert interviews and analysis of primary documents. We sought to reconstruct the evolution of EU regulatory governance in each domain and to assess the changing balance between experimentalism, uniform regulation, and DI within it. So in the next section, we're going to present very briefly our key findings on each domain. We're going to focus on the incidence of XG relative to uniform regulation, differentiated integration, both in terms of formal institutional structures and organizational practices. And I can say that for both of these sectors, we have a very detailed working paper, which you can find on the website of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies, and also in our SSRN online series. So if you're interested, I encourage, on the empirical basis of what we're going to say, I encourage you to go look at that. And then finally, we'll draw some comparative conclusions from the cases about how far XG may be considered an effective and legitimate alternative, or in some respects, complement to both uniform regulation and differentiated integration. And now I'll turn it over to Bernardo.
So, thanks, Jonathan. So let me start discussing the case of electricity by telling you how the scope conditions that Jonathan just mentioned look like in this policy domain. Starting with interdependence, well, we can see a lot of it. And this is actually increasing the more European markets are becoming interconnected. You know, electricity flows don't stop at the national borders, they follow the laws of physics. And also we see more and more of this due to the increasing penetration of renewables. If we move then to politicization, of course we can debate how high politicization really is in electricity compared to other policy domains, but it is a fact that energy is intimately linked to core state powers. I mean, think just of the origins of the European Union. And if we move to more recent decades, we can see easily that many governments, not only the usual suspects, not only the French governments, have often intervened in markets in order to defend their national champions from foreign acquisitions. If we look at uncertainty, there is quite a lot of cognitive challenges in this domain. This is not only at the very beginning. This was not only the very beginning of market liberalization and integration in the late 1990s, when these issues were virgin territory. But there is quite a lot of uncertainty also about more contemporary issues. Think of how to best move towards a sustainable energy system. You know, there are a lot of experts, but there isn't agreement on what is the best technical solution and way forward. And finally, there is also quite a lot of national diversity. Member states have different endowments when it comes to primary energy sources. They took they made different choices in terms of fuel mixes. And also there is some variation, both historically but also more recently, in the extent of public ownership of major companies. So as in the project as a whole, also of course in this specific case study, we looked at the relationship between uniform regulation, differentiated integration, and experimentalist governance. I broke down the electricity domain in 5 issue areas. The first 2, network access and network pricing, are really market issues, because these are network industries, just like railways or communication or water. So if you don't have access to naturally monopolistic networks and at a fair pricing, then you're not going to have competition. But of course, electricity regulation is not limited to market issues. And so we also looked at more operational issues, if you like. And this go by the name of regional security coordination. What this really means is the coordination between the management of national networks so that we can avoid blackouts. Then we also looked at a novel and major regulatory initiative, which is at the crossroads of financial and energy regulation. And it has to do with the detectance and deterrence of market abuse and insider trading. And finally, we broaden up our perspective to look at the new generation of rules, which are known as network codes and framework guidelines, which are really being produced to govern all cross-border electricity exchanges. If we move to the next slide, please. So this table gives you really a picture of what are our key findings in this domain. So, of course, on the first column, you have these 5 issue areas. In the second one, we have looked at whether rules are uniform, so they are the same across all member states, or they are differentiated, as typical of differentiated integration. And what we find is that in all of our subcases, at any point in time, there has not been differentiated integration. So a rule has always been the same, applying in the same way to all member states. But if we look then at the following column, then we see that these uniform rules have also become increasingly detailed over time. So if we compare the first electricity directive from 1996, that was a document of maybe 10 or 12 or 15 pages. If we compare that with the network codes that are being produced nowadays, which are equally binding, we have documents of 200 or 300 pages. So there has been a huge increase in the level of specification and detail of rules. And finally, if we focus attention on processes rather than the nature of rules per se, we find quite a lot of experimentalist governance, again, across all issue areas. Now, let me guide you through the findings a little bit more in detail. If we move to the next slide, please. So, starting with the nature of rules, as I just mentioned, one key finding is that rules have always applied homogeneously across all member states. So that's our first important key finding. There is no evidence of differentiated integration. And the second important key finding is that rules became progressively more detailed, but nevertheless, they always leave, either explicitly or implicitly, or both, some room for national discretion, for local discretion. And this points to the impossibility and perhaps also undesirability of complete codification. Or if we want to use other terms, we could say to the fact that contracts are always incomplete. If we move to the next slide, please. And if we then focus on processes rather than the nature of rules, we see something quite strange. And this is our third specific key finding. Uniform and increasingly detailed rules were not developed and imposed hierarchically by higher level actors, as we would have expected. And in this case, of course, the hierarchical actor is the European Commission. Instead, these uniform and increasingly detailed rules have been developed and regularly revised through experimentalist reviews of different local implementation experiences. And for that purpose, multi-stakeholder institutional architectures, bringing together public and private actors at different governance levels, EU and national one, have been key. Examples of such architectures are the Florence Forum, but also the Agency for Cooperation of Energy Regulators. If we move to the final slide for my section, please. So now, putting all the pieces together, putting these three specific findings together, what comes out is a strange animal, something that we are not used to. Because we do not see uniform fixed rules imposed from the top, as typical of hierarchical governance, but we do not see either the typical experimentalist governance structure or form, which involves framework rules granting quite a lot of discretion to lower level units. Instead, we see a new form of governance, we can say a revised or a simplified form of experimentalist governance, in which uniform and detailed rules are nevertheless made and revised experimentally. So they are made by a number of actors rather than unilaterally, and based on review of local implementation experiences, and frequently revised on that basis. And now I'm going to pass the floor again to Jonathan, who is going to emphasize, among other things, a very similar finding in the field of finance.
Thank you, Bernardo. So here, what I'm going to emphasize is the way in banking regulation and supervision, experimentalism is combined with both uniform regulation and differentiated integration. So first, let's, as with the case of electricity, just briefly review the scope conditions or the conditions that hold for the policy domain. We definitely have a high level of interdependence, especially within the Eurozone, but also within the internal market more broadly. We saw this in terms of cross-border contagion during the financial crisis and the doom loop between banks and sovereigns that underlay the revisions of banking and financial regulation more generally since 2009, 2010. And here, regulatory arbitrage and level playing field concerns are very salient. Secondly, while there might be some question about the level of politicization in energy, there's no such question about banking, the costs of banking bailouts, issues of protection of national champions, historic links to core state powers are all very strong. It's also true, however, that national markets and business models in banking remain significantly diverse, and this also reflects differences in legislative legal frameworks for all kinds of things, including business insolvency. This is a sector which is also clearly characterized by a high level of strategic uncertainty associated with rapidly changing markets, technologies, and business strategies. Indeed, the classic challenge for regulators has been to keep up with the changes that are happening in the regulated entities. So if we look at what has happened since the financial and euro crises, we have wound up with a system which could be called differentiated supervision nested within uniform regulation. So the biggest innovation has been the creation of a single supervisory mechanism, or the SSM, which is attached to the European Central Bank. Participation is mandatory for Eurozone member states, but it's open to close cooperation by others. And we can see this as a distinctive form of differentiated integration. We also need, however, to take account of the European Banking Authority, the EBA, which remains responsible for the EU-wide banking regulation, which particularly since the financial crisis is now seen intended as a single rule book. And so its role includes advising the Commission on binding technical and regulatory standards under EU legislation and promulgating supervisory guidelines for the internal market. So in that sense, we have an element of uniform regulation at the EU-wide level. Now, I want to present briefly my findings on the SSM, which is what I focused on, in terms of three overlapping perspectives, three different ways of looking at the SSM. First of all, as a centralized hierarchy seeking to impose and enforce uniform rules, standards, and procedures across the banking union. Secondly, as a polyarchic network seeking to orchestrate intensive cooperation between the ECB and national supervisors. And finally, as an experimentalist organization seeking to accommodate and learn from diversity by adapting common rules and procedures to the specificities of individual banks and revising these regularly through peer review of implementation experience. And I'll just take you very quickly through each of them. Each captures an aspect of the SSM, although I will argue that the third is the most encompassing one. Okay, now I think, if you asked most students, scholars of the EU, how they see the SSM, they would certainly see it as a centralized hierarchy. So it's a single supranational supervisor for Eurozone banks with final authority over granting, withdrawing banking licenses. That's the power of life and death over banks. The ECB directly supervises the largest and most significant banks in the Eurozone, and it can take over supervision of less significant institutions or LSIs from national competent authorities where necessary, where it deems so necessary. It's committed to, the SSM is committed to what they call intrusive hands-on oversight of significant institutions through joint supervisory teams of ECB and national officials. And the SSM has created very detailed and prescriptive manuals and guides to promote harmonization and convergence of supervisory approaches. But we also need to take account of the extent to which it is also a polyarchic network. And it's not so widely understood that all major decisions of the SSM must be approved by the supervisory board, where NCAs account for 21 of 27 votes. And when the legislation talks about the role of the ECB, it vests this in the supervisory board. So it is really a much more pluralistic and polyarchic institution than you might think. And also for that reason, all major initiatives and policies of the SSM are actually developed through various, a very dense web of joint networks between the ECB and the national authorities. And finally, the national authorities retain an independent voice on EU banking regulation, so that is on the rulemaking process, through the EBA with double majority voting arrangements to safeguard the interests of Eurozone outs. Finally, I want to emphasize the extent to which the SSM can be understood as an experimentalist organization. So if we look at the design of its supervisory model, this was the outcome of joint deliberation and very explicit comparison of national practices by mixed ECB and NCA teams. Its rules, practices, and methodologies are developed and regularly revised through ongoing peer review, again, by mixed groups of European and national officials. Its manuals and guides are explicitly seen as living documents subject to continuous review and improvement in light of implementation experience. And very importantly, frontline supervisors in the national authorities and in the ECB itself can and regularly do propose revisions to rules, procedures, and methodologies based on local application. So like EU electricity regulation, the SSM and indeed also the EBA clearly diverges from the classic experimentalist architecture in important respects. Rather than setting open-ended framework goals and giving lower-level actors substantial autonomy to pursue them in ways adapted to their own local circumstances, the SSM has developed increasingly detailed and prescriptive rules and methods which banking supervisors are expected to apply as consistently as possible across jurisdictions in order to avoid regulatory arbitrage and ensure a level playing field for Eurozone banks. So that looks like uniform regulation. But within these limits, experimentalist practices of learning from diversity, peer review, and continuous revision based on local implementation experience are central to its organization. And this is not just an emergent phenomenon, rather the adoption of such practices flows directly from the SSM's deliberate efforts to adapt its rules, methods, and procedures to banks' diverse business models on the one hand, so the condition of diversity, and constantly to update them in response to rapidly changing markets and technologies on the other. So their strategic uncertainty. Okay, let me conclude very quickly. So the cases of electricity and banking show that the combination of high interdependence with high uncertainty may result in the emergence of simplified experimentalist governance architectures based on a single set of harmonized but provisional rules, revisable through ongoing monitoring and review of local implementation. In such architectures, the framework rules and procedures may be progressively specified and discretion for lower level actors at any given moment narrowed, but the rules and procedures themselves remain contestable in light of local application. And revisions based on learning from comparative review of implementation experience provide a crucial source of improvement and adaptability for the governance system as a whole. And I think that there are other policy domains within the EU, ranging from chemicals regulation to competition, to telecoms, to the emerging field of digital regulation, where we see very similar conditions and can expect similar architectures. So these cases of banking and electricity also support the view that under such conditions, uniform rules and practices can be accepted as effective and legitimate by member states, provided that they are applied in contextually sensitive ways and revised regularly through deliberative procedures in which national officials themselves participate. So our comparative findings suggest that far from uniformity and experimentalism being mutually antithetical, what we can call diachronic experimentalism may be a necessary condition for synchronic uniformity of regulation within a diverse polity like the EU. And that's probably our most general finding. Let me add a finding about differentiated integration. Although differentiated integration allowed the SSM and indeed the banking union more generally to move forward initially in the face of opposition from non-Euro member states, differentiated integration does nothing to address the challenges of integrating diversity among its members, for which the SSM's experimentalist organization and practices are instead essential. I do think that that general point that differentiated integration addresses only one axis of diversity and doesn't deal with the remaining diversity among those who go forward with new integration schemes is crucial. So the case of EU banking regulation and supervision thus suggests that experimentalist governance and differentiated integration may be complementary, but asymmetrically so, insofar as differentiated integration depends on experimentalist governance to accommodate diversity within and across separate groups of member states, but the same is not true vice versa. In many cases, experimentalist governance does not need differentiated integration and can be an alternative to it. So I will stop there, and I look forward to Sandra's comments and also to those of the questions that the rest of the audience may have.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me and giving me the opportunity to comment on this really rich work. As you said, it's a whole research project, and obviously there's a lot in there. And as you said already, there's several papers coming out. So first of all, I really want to congratulate you on this comparison also of the two very complex sectors, which oftentimes are examined separately, like people tend to focus only on one area and then draw conclusions. So I think this is really, really important that we have more of this comparative research. So I think it's really a highly insightful read. I will focus on the paper and how I see it, how it works, sort of standalone, knowing that, of course, you would have a lot of material for other papers, and I see its contribution in two ways. First of all, as I said, it provides this comparison of two highly complex sectors. And second, it addresses what I would call a differentiated integration in sectoral governance at work. So sort of what difference does it make to have or have not a DI? And I think, of course, the comparison of these two areas of market integration, banking, where we have this differentiated integration, electricity, where we don't have it as a sort of counterfactual, is really, really insightful in that regards. So this is sort of the praise part. And now I will, of course, move on to some suggestions, questions, and maybe also some critical points to make a wise use of my time. I think I still have sort of 8 minutes. On the conceptual framework and the conceptual discussion, I think it's very well developed, it's very rich, but I'm left with one key issue, and that is sort of the status of these 3 alternatives as you frame it: differentiated integration, or DI, XG, experimentalist governance, and uniform regulation, UR. So I'm wondering, are these really alternatives, sort of to challenge this claim? Is experimentalist governance not rather sort of looking at how integration is working, and it might be differentiated or might not be differentiated? And I found the table and the electricity part insightful in that respect, because if you look at table 1, there's a differentiation. Well, I use the term differentiation now, or there's a distinction between differentiated integration, which concerns the type of rules, are they uniform, yes or no, and experimentalist governance concerns rule-making process. So one could argue these are analytically distinct categories, and the question would rather be how the presence of differentiation then affects governance, be it experimentalist or some other way of governance. The other thing, the relationship between XG and uniform regulation, I was wondering a bit, is uniform regulation not sort of a stylized category? I mean, we know it's of long standing in the single market integration discussion. Harmonization is a different concept for sure, but we know that we've moved away from this idea to have like harmonization or uniform standards in many areas, and to allow for some degree of divergence. So I was wondering, is this really an alternative? I mean, it surely is analytically speaking, but empirically, well, probably not very relevant what you find in your research. Now, let me move on to the research question. There, I was wondering whether you really have one single research question or whether there are several. On page 6, which is also headed by cases and methods, maybe the research question should move up front. The question reads, or you say that you compare the capacity of experimentalist governance versus differentiated integration to accommodate diversity. So again, it's this alternative question. You do not focus that much on uniform regulation for obvious reasons. Then on page 9, I was wondering, because it's stated there, you examine the relationship between these 3, which would rather suggest they're complementary and not necessarily alternatives. And then on page 17, the research question that occurred to me was rather how to reconcile uniformity and diversity inside the SSM. So maybe these are variations of one overarching question, but it's not always sort of entirely clear what the main focus is. Then I have a few comments about research design. Maybe I also skip some of them, and we can also exchange, of course, bilaterally to allow for time also in the Q&A section. The first one is, of course, that you focus on the presence and absence of differentiated integration. So you compare banking and electricity. I mean, here, of course, one alternative would have been to also consider external differentiation in the case of electricity, which is really compelling because, as you said, it's physics, it's not politics. But then if you think of countries such as Switzerland, there's a lot of politics, and have also a paper that will come out soon in JCMS on this, on UK and Switzerland in banking and electricity, and how it is sort of this external differentiation is a problem, or is a problematic thing. So that would have been, and then when you elaborate on the scope conditions on page 3 for both differentiated integration and experimentalist governance, I was expecting this is guiding the case selection, but it seems it's very complex how these scope conditions apply. And another thing in terms of the research design, which I found sort of a bit difficult to understand, is why in one sector you have this division between 5 substantial areas, so 5 sort of subcases, one could argue, whereas in the SSM case, you focus just on the governance, so to speak. And then also in looking at these subcases in electricity, there's almost no variation on the 3 dimensions. So the question here is, of course, a bit, is this to reinforce the overall argument, or is it, what's the purpose of these subcases? And of course, it also means that the sort of the case discussion is very different. Like, of course, Bernardo, you have these very different fields of regulation where you do an excellent job in explaining them, because you could spend like a whole book on each of them. And then Jonathan focuses on the SSM and elaborates much more on the institutions, on the role of ECB. So it's a bit different type of case study, really. And I was wondering why you opted for such different sort of case designs within your comparison. And I was also wondering why you would focus so much on the SSM, because then you do no longer vary sort of the presence and the absence of differentiation so much. One could also have been looking more at how this is bridged under the single rule book. So how sort of the SSM and the EBA sort of interact, and how sort of this experimentalism at work helps to overcome maybe some, you know, difficulties in having similar approaches, or maybe then this differentiation is not even that important substantively in a way in the process. So I think that would have made even a stronger argument if you could have shown that the regulatory process is not that different inside and outside the EBU, or you could address the question, really, does experimentalist governance have a different quality inside versus outside the EBU? So I think that is really regarding the sort of the case study, which is a bit different for each of the sectors. Then, of course, for the findings, I have a few points, but I can also send them to you bilaterally, that you could maybe briefly talk about alternative explanations, such as interest power struggles involved. Like we know in electricity, it sounds as if there's a lot of learning and sort of optimal solutions brought sort of bottom up by all these stakeholders, but we also know there's still a few issues like price zones also, where there's politics involved and a lot of sort of opposition from the national level. And the same, of course, in banking. As you say, we have very different business models and also some resistance, of course, from corporate. That is my watch. Sorry for that. So I have spent my 10 minutes already, it seems. Yeah, I think so. And then one last point on the conclusion, but I'm happy to forward, of course, my comments to you in written form. and also the last slides you have presented, Jonathan. I really also searched for the words in the text. You speak about the synchronic uniformity and diachronic revisability, but it is in the introduction and in the conclusion, but you never really develop it in the paper. So to someone who is uninformed, an uninformed reader about experimentalist governance, it might maybe be too abstract and not understand how do I recognize it when I see it in those two cases, and how does it relate to what you introduced up front with these three alternatives. So I think it could be a bit streamlined and then to make the argument even more convincing. But as I said, congratulations to this rich comparison of two highly complex sectors, and I really look forward to seeing and reading the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra, and thank you very much for your discipline with having your own watch, so I don't have anything to do or to say. Because your discussion was so rich, maybe Jonathan and Bernardo will want to already address some of the questions and comments. And in the meantime, if anybody else has a question, a comment, some form of feedback, just raise your hands and I will give you the floor as soon as Jonathan and Bernardo have reacted to Sandra's comments.
Thank you, Sandra. This is a very rich set of comments. Let me, I don't think I will try to address all of them right now in order to give other people a chance to come in. And I also invite Bernardo to do so. I think I want to focus perhaps on two or three key points. One would be the issue of the opening conceptual framing and then how the paper develops and what it finds. So the opening conceptual framing really reflects, let us say, what we could call this state of the literature and theorizing about these three types of governance or regulation. And what we find in the paper is precisely that the way in which two key dimensions, the nature of the rules at any one given time, that's the synchronic, and the way in which the rules are made, implemented, and revised differ from the stylized models that we started from. So, broadly speaking, we do find that for good reason in electricity and also in banking, both at the level of regulation, but also of supervision within the banking union, there are good reasons why the actors themselves are very committed to having uniform rules at any given moment and to narrowing relative to the past and relative to the theoretical models, the discretion available to the frontline actors. But at the same time, the rules themselves and all the methodologies, everything to do with that, are both developed from explicit comparisons of national and local practice, and they are regularly updated and revised through this process of application, of comparison and review of application. And so in that sense, one of the key findings is that in these kinds of sectors, at least within the EU, we see a different combination of governance elements than in the classic models, including the classic experimentalist governance architecture, which I showed you. And so I think that is what explains why we start with one framing and then we revise the framing in the process. But I hope that it's also possible to recognize how that description of what we find is really elaborated in the cases and doesn't just, it's simply presented in a kind of higher order, more theoretical language in the conclusion. I don't think it's, there really is a gap there, but if there is, that's something that we need to work on in the presentation. And then just one additional point, which is on the relationship between the SSM and the EBA. So there, you know, I focused the research on the SSM because clearly that is the really innovative and novel dimension of governance and regulation in this sector. But both in terms of the interviews with national authorities and the people in the ECB itself, and also in the EBA, we did reconstruct the relationship between them. And indeed, the fact that the EBA pretty self-consciously operates in an experimentalist way and had been recognized to do so by previous scholars like Eilish Ferran, for example, does help to explain how how you can have not only experimentalism within banking supervision within the SSM, but also that can be linked up to the uniform rulemaking at the EU level. And I think it's an important point. Probably one could even emphasize it more, but it is there in the argument. So maybe I will stop there and let Bernardo take up some of the points addressed to him.
So thanks a lot, Sandra. I mean, these comments are really very good, and I don't have. I mean, I think we need to think carefully about how to address them. Just a few quick reactions. I mean, I think you're totally right about this asymmetry in our treatment of the two domains, and I mean, in part, this. I mean, I know that at some point we have to address research design, etc. But in reality, what happened is that, you know, we started the project with 3 domains. There was also GMOs, and then one has been delayed. And the electricity analysis built on my previous analysis, so I could go more in depth and so on. So this is I think is the real explanation. Now, how do we transform this into a justification of research design? We still need to think about that. But then very quickly on external differentiated integration, in one working paper that I wrote based on this project, indeed there is also, I mean, I also looked at the external differentiated integration in the electricity sector, and there is quite a lot. But there is quite a lot, not only in terms of rules. So not only we have EU rules that apply to non-EU member states, but also we have non-EU member states that contribute to the development of those rules. And so I think this is what Sandra Lavenex is called extended governance. And then finally on whether DI, uniform regulation, and experimentalist are the real alternative, and what's, you know, what are the areas in which they overlap or not. I think we saw that at the very beginning of the Horizon 2020 project, that somebody was saying differentiated integration is more static, is more about rules. Experimentalist governance is more about processes. I think experimentalist governance is about process, but also about rules. But it's true that DI is only, I would say, about rules. I'm not very convinced that uniform regulation doesn't exist or is a straw man and so on, because I think this is the kind of comment you get when you engage with hierarchical governance, then you don't find it, and then somebody tells you, but it doesn't really exist. But you know, if we relax a bit, let's say the ideotypical form, then we can have examples where some key actor, higher level actors, developed less inclusively some rules and imposed them on other recalcitrant actors. This is what I found in GAS, for example, in network access. And this is quite different from the typical experimentalist governance approach. But thanks a lot. The comments were really good. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So there are several questions, I think. The first one is Julius Rumpf. You have the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Julius Rumpf from the University of Oslo. And before I start, many thanks for this very interesting presentation. I'm very much looking forward to the paper, since I'm also doing quite a bit of research on the electricity market. And so my comments will naturally be more directed to Mr. Bernardo Rangoni. And just a disclaimer, I'm a lawyer, so I might be the odd one out here today. And my question would be that you included the network codes and guidelines in your analysis, but you did not include the terms, conditions, and methodologies. And this surprised me because in my perception, these could really reinforce some of your arguments. It's my impression, especially as far as experimentalist governance is concerned. Here, I'm sorry if I don't have a theoretical depth here because I come from a different field, but I think if you just look at the network codes and guidelines, especially the guidelines that basically empty shells without the TCMs. And then also, I was a bit surprised when you stated that you didn't consider the electricity sector to be differentiated integration, because in my perception, it's especially these terms, conditions, and methodologies that allow for regional or even national solutions and give quite a bit of discretion. And if we take it one step further from a legal perspective, if you look at discretion and how to measure it, the lawyer would always look at the legal recourse, at the possibilities to take things to court. And especially there with the terms, conditions, and methodologies, you have quite a bit of discretion by the lower level actors all the way down to the national actors. And finally, just a short comment. This was already raised in the comment by Mrs. Eckert. It's not a big point, but I think that electricity is actually quite a politicized subject. Not only the price zones, but for example, here in Norway, the level of interconnection to the European neighbors, it's highly political. The power prices, the high power prices, it's a highly political subject. The energy transition, using coal in Poland, it's a very political subject. So yes, perhaps you have some comments on that. Thank you very much.
Jonathan, Bernardo, would you prefer to take two rounds of questions, or do you prefer to answer one by one?
I mean, maybe we should collect some questions.
Okay, Antoinetta.
Yes, I apologize. I'm not familiar so much with the debate on differentiated integration. So my question is a little bit similar to Sandra's comments, but it's really mostly for clarification. So if I look at the way that EU legislation get updated under, shall we say, normal circumstances, under whatever community method regulation that you like, let me take cultural heritage, which I looked at last. There is also iterative adjustment, implementation reports, national practices, and regular updates. So I just would like to ask you to clarify further, what is the difference theoretically, but maybe also empirically, between experimentalism and almost any framework regulation in the EU that takes regular updates? And also, if you look at council working groups, there's constant comparison of national practices. Just really for my understanding.
Okay, so thanks, Julius, for the comments. Basically, I agree with all of them. I think we both me and Jonathan, agree with all of them. We didn't look at the terms and conditions in the presentation just because actually I had a number of illustrations and Jonathan told me we don't have time for that, so take them away. But if you look at the paper that Jonathan mentioned, you'll find some reference to terms and conditions. And we agree with you that this is, so maybe for the non-energy specialists, these terms and conditions are the yet new generation of rules that is being produced, and it's even more detailed than the network codes. Okay, now I think that, as you suggested, they reinforce experimentalist findings, but you know, this local discretion and differentiated integration are not necessarily the same thing. Okay, so local discretion is perfectly consistent with experimentalist governance. Okay, now what we didn't find are evidence of differentiated integration, meaning you have a certain rule that applies to, I don't know, Germany and France, but not to others. Okay, that's a different thing than having a relatively broad rule that allows you know, different ways underneath it. Okay, and I mean, we are also very happy to hear that you consider electricity politicized. I mean, I made that comment that some may disagree and so on, because I know that the differentiated integration scholars would say, of course, you don't find differentiated integration because it's not very politicized. So this is why I said we can debate about this and so on. But it's good to hear that others think otherwise. Thanks.
So let me respond to Antoinetta, which in a way, you know, I am also in agreement. That is to say that you know, in the first piece that Charles Sable and I wrote about experimentalist governance in the EU, called Learning from Difference, that came out in the European Law Journal, we called it the new architecture of governance in the European Union. And our argument was that if we look at the evolution of governance in the EU since the late 90s, there was more and more evolution in the direction of this kind of experimentalist architecture with relatively open framework rules, sometimes often metrics for assessing progress towards them, often based on explicit comparison and synthesis of different kinds of national approaches. Then, especially if we're dealing with framework directives, leaving a substantial degree of discretion to the national actors about implementation, but typically having some form of ongoing monitoring and review leading to periodic revision. Now, I would say that distinctive of experimentalist governance is the intensity and the explicitness of the monitoring and review, so that there are, you know, EU policy domains where that is looser. What we're doing in this work is even going a step further and trying to show that actually, even in all these areas of the internal market, where there has been a very much a tightening up of the rules at any one time, that they become more detailed and that they leave less space for discretion for national actors, not no space, as Bernardo just pointed out, but less space. Nonetheless, the rules themselves are made, monitored, and revised through similar kinds of experimentalist processes. So I would say that kind of deepens the claim that, as we sometimes say, even if experimentalist governance is neither universal nor ubiquitous in the EU, it is very widespread and institutionalized, maybe increasingly so across policy domains. Thanks.
Thanks a lot for the nice discussion. My points, I think, also beats upon some of the questions that were made. Just some, passing comments on the question of politicization of electricity. I think I would say that electricity is not a salient domain, but it is highly politicized because it really touches upon those core state powers. And so when, in moments of crisis, for example, it really goes quickly up to the minister level. But in normal time, it is not, it's not salient. But even in, in the technical negotiations, it can get politicized. So that could be one way of rounding up this debate. On the question of differentiation, I was also a bit puzzled because it seems to me that in both of your cases, there is some differentiation, but you're not, you're excluding it a little bit in the banking union. Of course, there's no differentiation. That's the point of the banking union, but there is differentiation within the European Union because not all countries are part of the banking union. And so you excluded it from your design, but it's there. And here also, but although there is an interesting question, is the fact that there is the uniform rule also puts a pressure on other countries to join. We know that there's been a debate. It's likely that at some point other countries will join. So yeah, it could be interesting questions, to which extent the uniformization of rule, produces a decline in differentiations or some incentivizing. And likewise, I think in electricity, I also agree that this, the rules are extremely strict and the same, but still you have all these regional coordinators. So you again here have a bit of a tension. So if you don't look at the rules, but the practice, the implementation, you would find it. Then I had three, more theoretical points. The first one, which I think is really similar to one of the points raised by Sandra and also Antoinetta. It seems to me that your presentation of uniform governance is a bit simplistic. If you look at all the recent work on implementation, for example, I'm thinking about the work on customization by Eva Thoman. You find, all these, things you're talking about, the interactions, ways of customizing, adapting the policy and so forth. So I see a lot of convergences here between your approach and what you think is what you present as uniform governance. And then and I think, and you look at a lot of, this rulemaking process, and I think it could be interesting to look at a bit more rules from the point of view of implementation. And then, if you look at both banking and electricity, if you think of, how rules are implemented, and I think it raises more problems and conflicts than you are addressing in your presentation, where it looks like, it's nice, they negotiate and they, you have these networks and people come together, they revise the rules, but it's much more conflictual than that. And you have to ask, you could ask to which extent isn't adaptation, maybe let me rephrase it, at which point does adaptation becomes a deviation of the rule, and then you would maybe find again some differentiations or some explosions of the model, and you find such examples of deviation which are really posing a threat to the uniform rules, both in electricity and in banking. And in banking, you have I'm thinking about those German banks where that the SSM treats very gently. I don't remember the cases, but I know it's about Germany. And then you have all the way the SSM goes around to try to avoid the implementation of the crisis, basically crisis rulings for Italian banks. All this kind of situation questions the uniformity of the rule, and devoids of it devoids the essence of the type of ruling. Same goes for electricity, and all very nice, but part of the reason why they have to make the rule more stringent is that in times of crisis, many member states have a serious tendency to say, no, I don't implement the rules, I do what I want. Yeah, so it was, and then this brings to my third point. I'm wondering about the extent to which this, this experimentalist governance doesn't reveal the extent to which these organizations, the SSM and the where electricity is regulated, doesn't reveal their lack of power and legitimacy to some extent. Because the fact that the SSM or the SRB in the case of banking shows that they don't have sufficient legitimacy and power to be able to enforce the strict rules. So they have to rely on the type of rule. And I think it would be interesting to engage with those notions a bit more directly. Thank you so much again for this wonderful presentation, and I think really great comparison.
Thank you. So now we have Elliot Posner.
Thank you. First, congratulations to the both of you for this excellent comparison. I look forward to reading the paper. And I just wanted to, before I get to my question, I just wanted to say that if this could be a breakthrough, I've been following experimentalism for time, and I like this distinction, the fact that you followed your evidence and came up with this diachronic versus synchronic distinction. I've been looking mostly at the banking. I know the banking sector more than electricity. Seems to me that you are moving towards an ability to answer the outstanding question of, can there be legal certainty? Can you stop regulatory arbitrage in banking in the EU with so much experimentalist processes as part of the way rules and supervision are done? Now, my question is really about the penalty defaults. It's another area of experimentalism that I've long paid attention to, because I come from international relations. And for me, I always, when I think of the politics of banking in the EU, I think of power bargaining. And I know that your slide, and you mentioned that experimentalism is underpinned by penalty defaults, but I'm wondering where that is in your thinking these days, and how it comes up in electricity, as well as banking.
Thank you. Maybe we can take the last question I see from Jose Maria Valenzuela.
Thank you. It's been a really fantastic presentation, but I have a couple of specific questions regarding the notion of polyarchy as you described these networks, because I would like to. Many times the notion of polyarchy, polyarchical networks tries to describe very horizontal organizations or arrangement of organizations. And I wonder whether there is not some dimension of size, power, influence that is systematic regarding some organizations, some regulators in some particular countries having an outsized influence throughout all of the periods of comparison and in the different domains. So that's something that's kind of an empirical interest. And the other component, the other also empirical question is of whether, I think in other areas of European regulation, we hear a lot of the roles on the courts and the justice system or the judicial system. And how does that play, or if not, why doesn't it play a role in framing this process of experimentation, but also uniformity after all? So that seems to me quite interesting, quite outstanding.
Okay, Bernardo, do you want to start first with the questions that have been addressed to you, and then I'll pick up a few of them?
Yeah, so thanks for the comments. So Lydie, I think that, I mean, you made a number of comments. So I think one part of an answer to your comments is that we need to be clear about how we define, you know, this different forms of governance, and differentiated integration in the whole Horizon 2020 project has been defined in legal formal terms. Okay. So really having a set of rules which applies only to a set of countries, but not to others, right? And this is different from, so in the project there were actually a couple of other working packages, the one where we worked, another one on flexible implementation, and these were presented as other ways of accommodating the need for diversity. Okay. So I think, you know, quite a lot of the answers lie in precisely how we define what it is and what it is not. On the presence of politics, which I think was one other thing that you were mentioning, I totally agree. I think that also Jonathan agrees. And I mean, we haven't, maybe we haven't stressed this enough, but I think Jonathan was trying to pass the message that experimentalism can be basically a machine not only for learning, but also for facilitating also consensus. And in a way, I think you also pointed out, you know, in some situations it's very difficult for some higher level actors to impose certain rules on others, even if they had the legal powers to do that. You know, because then they would find problems down the road in terms of implementation and so on. So it makes quite a lot of sense to, you know, bring a number of actors together, get them discussing, get them seeing, you know, what works less, and so on. And this may facilitate the development of agreements. Now, I just moved to Elliot's comment on penalty defaults. I'm trying to also make some contributions here. It's not the primary focus of this paper, but I have separate work, and my view, and I think probably here Jonathan will not completely agree, but I think that we need to see, you know, to what extent specific positive threats are used, typical of the shadow hierarchy, or instead actors are induced to participate and cooperate through negative measures, such as fines, such as prohibitions, or maybe commitments that are proposed directly by lower level actors. I think that the potential disagreement here may be on how we distinguish between the two empirically. There may be some concept stretching, but I think more work is needed there. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
I'll say anything about Jose's question. Jose, I don't know if you know him, works on electricity. So maybe you can say just a word about the polyarchy horizontal network issue.
I didn't get. I know Jose, and I'm happy to see him, but I don't. I didn't really get exactly. If you can rephrase your question, I'm happy to play.
Yes. So the idea is that the concept of polyarchy describes tends to describe nodes or entities with similar levels of power or capacity to influence. That's kind of the idea. Everyone has a potential to influence, but the opposite might be a more hierarchical structure with only some actors actually having an influence on everyone else. So I wonder whether this is truly a horizontal polyarchical structure of influence, or whether there's some hierarchy where some actors in some of the most advanced countries, that might be the biggest countries or might be small, middle-sized countries, have an outsized influence on the rest.
Okay, thanks. Now I got it. I mean, again, in some work that I'm doing right now, I'm trying to distinguish. Basically, I argue that polyarchic distributions of power can be understood in legal terms, but also in de facto terms. Okay, So it might be that we have a distribution of powers that doesn't give, that is not centralized, legally speaking. But of course, this doesn't exclude that some actors will have much more influence than others. You know, so I guess it depends, you know, on how you conceptualize power. And power, I think, can be conceptualized both legally, but also in de facto terms, which have much more to do with political support, coalitions, etc. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Let me come in quickly. In responding to Lydie, let me make 3 points, 2 of which reiterate points that Bernardo made. We have to distinguish between differentiation and differentiated integration. Differentiated integration, in the strict sense, is a regime in which some member states participate and others don't. In that respect, of course, as I said, the banking union is a form of differentiated integration. What is interesting about it, among other things, is that the rulemaking at the EU level is not differentiated. So it is a form, the supervision is a form of differentiated integration, which is nested within EU-wide rulemaking. Secondly, you know, I completely agree both with the point which in a way Antoinetta raised, that within EU regulation adopted through the community method, there are often options available to member states to do things differently. Those are, it's not differentiated integration because it's a common framework that gives different national options and discretions. And also the broader point that when we go down to the front line of implementation, it is never possible nor desirable to implement rules in a fully uniform way. They always have to be contextually adapted. But the difference with experimentalism is the very explicit monitoring and deliberation about the issues that arise when you try to adapt general rules to specific local cases, and the use of that experience and knowledge through comparisons to revise the rules themselves. So in that sense, it goes beyond flexible implementation, it goes beyond street level bureaucracy. Within the SSM, I don't think I would agree with the arguments about legitimacy or lack of power, or treating, for example, German banks softly. The SSM is in the midst of a very tough conflict with Deutsche Bank about various aspects of its business models and practices. You could hardly pick a more, you know, high-profile actor to challenge. I would say, though, that the situation of the single resolution board is a quite different one, and it's very clear that banking union in the resolution field as well as in deposit insurance is incomplete and fragmented. We've talked about that in the past, and I would not see that as a case of experimentalism. For Elliot's question, I don't know whether, I think I would distinguish between the issue of can the regulators keep pace with the regulated entities, which has been very big in finance. That's been the, you know, $1 billion question. I think the SSM is closer to being able to do that probably than any financial regulator in the world. Also in the past, in terms of penalty defaults, it has, you know, really a lot of arrows in its quiver. I mean, the main thing is to, in fact, is where the analysis becomes important, to distinguish it between classic hierarchical enforcement, but they can close down a bank, they can order banks to redo their processes, they can challenge the appointment of bank directors. I mean, they have really a lot of power, and they use it in a process-oriented way, which engages with Bernardo's point. That is, that the banks are expected to have robust processes on a whole series of different dimensions, and when they're challenged, it is to force them to develop those processes better. For example, to justify their internal models, which the SSM is able to review. As regards power bargaining, what is interesting, I think we see that more of that still at the EBA level, or actually not quite the EBA level, but the level of new legislation. So the question of how and in what way the latest Basel Accord should be taken over into the revised capital requirements directive. There you still have arguments being put forward by France and Germany that there should be various kinds of carve-outs, and there you still see power politics ongoing at the EU level. Finally, for Jose Maria, I would elaborate a little bit on Bernardo's point, which is that we define polyarchy as the absence of hegemony. So no single actor, or we might even say group of actors, can impose their preferences on others without taking into account their views. There certainly are inequalities among the national competent authorities and between them and the ECB, but it's still very striking. The voting arrangements in the supervisory board that I mentioned, within the joint supervisory teams, the national officials who participate are employed by their national authorities and not by the ECB. So it's very difficult to give them direct orders. And then if we analyze these networks, we see that often key committees or working groups are chaired by officials from the national authorities, so they really have a voice. Of course, there are differences between very small authorities which lack the human and organizational capacities to participate on an equal footing. If you talk to, we interviewed the Slovenians, and they said, well, there aren't very many of us, and we have these opportunities to participate. We don't always have the people we can put into the network. So I mean, that is a fair comment, but I don't think that it undercuts the claim that the system as a whole, in the way it works, as well as the way it's designed on paper, can be understood polyarchically. So we've run over time, but let me just thank all of you for these great questions. We're very happy to supply a copy of the paper, and also to provide links to the more detailed papers that have the empirical information to support the arguments we've made.
Thanks indeed to everybody, and to Sandra in particular for the very good comments.
I just want to conclude by thank you, of course, Jonathan and Bernardo for their very interesting presentations, Sandra for the discussion, and all the participants for your questions and comments, and wish you a happy holidays, but also to invite you for the next seminar on the 20th of January with a very topical presentation by Antoinetta on the relation between Ukraine and the EU. So I hope to see you there after the winter break. Bye, everyone.